Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun during the pandemic to help authors whose tours had been canceled, independent bookstores whose doors had been shuttered, and just people who wanted to connect with great reading and authors and find out stuff. I'm absolutely thrilled to have, he's going to roll his eyes at me, but it's the legendary John Truby. John Truby is, he's perhaps the greatest expert in story structure ever. He's the founder and director of Truby Writer Studio. For over 30 years, he's taught more than zillions of people worldwide, including novelists, screenwriters, and even video game writers. He does consulting work with Disney, Sony, Fox, HBO, AMC, and more. So I have to tell you my Truby story that I was just telling John earlier. About 10 years ago, I never used story structure. I thought it killed creativity. One of my students at UCLA, and all students who are here now, one of my students at UCLA said, "Oh, do you know about Truby story structure?" And I said, "Forget it. It's going to kill creativity." She said, "No, it won't. Let me just send you this tape and listen. It'll change your life." And I said, yeah, sure it will. She sent me the tape. I wouldn't have listened to it, but she nagged and nagged me. I put it on, and the first thing I heard John Truby talk about were the moral component of a story. And I felt every neuron in my brain light up because it meant something. So I took a course from John. I stalked him until he had dinner with me. I bought his book. And I have to say that using his story structure, I had my very first New York Times best-selling acclaimed novel, and I owe it to John. So also I want to say that John's married to the fabulous novelist Leslie Lear, who's also a great friend of mine. And it was Leslie's prodding that helped get John to talk to me in the first place. So anyway, welcome, John Truby. We are so delighted to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Caroline, it is such a thrill for me to be here with you. I am such a fan of your work. You're such a terrific writer, and I'm really excited to be talking about this new book.
So before we get into this book, first look at the gorgeous cover, The Anatomy of Genres, how story form explains the way the world works and also how we work. We tell everybody at The Blaze, please buy your books from an independent bookstore. We like bookshop.org. Just put John Truby's name in and this book will come up, and also his first book, I should have it here someplace, The Anatomy of Story, which is also great. If you have questions for John, just pop them in the chat and I will get to asking him probably around in a half an hour. Okay, so let's talk about story. You and I have talked before about how many story gurus they get it wrong. They don't go deep enough or they simplify it. So I would like to know how you first came to your basic philosophy of story, and especially your seminal book on story, The Anatomy of Story.
Well, it's actually an interesting origin story, Caroline, because when I started out as a writer, none of these books were around. And I'm not going to tell you how long ago that is, but it's a while back. And so I had to self-teach. And luckily, I had a philosophy background from college, which gave me the tools to explore story at the deepest level. And what I did was, when I decided I'm going to do this, I watched 2 great films a day. I did that by working at the Carnegie Hall Cinema in New York City, and it was an art house theater. And I sat in the dark, took notes, broke every one of these things down. I did this for 3 years. And what I was looking for was what works and what doesn't work. And what I discovered was it's all under the surface. It's all in the structure for how these stories are doing what they do. And so I was able to construct a story theory that was not based on a particular culture, a particular country, the Hollywood system,
right?
Any of these ways of looking at story that, because we're so used to them, we think that's the only way to tell a story.
Right.
Not at all. Not at all. And so what I was looking for is a structure that could handle the complexity of story, the diversity of story, and allow people then to adapt that to their storytelling. Because one of the big problems I have with these other books on the subject, I go to conferences all the time. I was at an indie novel conference about 3 weeks ago and talked to all kinds of writers. And when I tell them what I do, they always say, "Oh, I know all about story. Yeah, I use 3-act structure, or
Oh, I hate 3-act structure. We're going to talk about that. All
yeah."
right, go ahead.
And they say, "Oh, I use Hero's Journey or Save the Cat," and I have to tell them, and I'm really reluctant to tell them because it's painful. I say, "Look, these things are great for beginners, but they
Right.
have almost no practical story techniques, and certainly almost nothing at the professional level." And what I've been obsessed with, Caroline, over the last 10 years, really since Anatomy of Story came out, is how do you get writers to that top 1%? Because those are the people who are creating their own story brand.
Right.
They are an individual story person, and that people go to. I want Caroline Leavitt stories. And you're the only person they can go to get those. Well, how do you get to that top 1%? And when I wrote originally Anatomy of Story, my idea was I want to include all the professional story techniques that you would need to write a professional level story, which I hope that I did.
Oh, absolutely. I think you did.
What it doesn't do, and why I realized there was such a need for this book, is that there's no mention of genres. And genres make up 99% of all stories sold. And so I realized what I've got to do is write a book that shows writers exactly how to write each of these genres, which is why the first half of each chapter goes through great detail, as I'm sure you've noticed, the 15 to 20 plot beats that have to be in that genre if you're going to do that genre properly. And if you don't do them properly, then the readers of that form who love that form, who come back to that form again and again, they'll get very upset with you. But then the second half, which is, I think, really groundbreaking in terms of a book on story, is where I go through the deeper life philosophy that is expressed in each genre's theme. And this is the area that almost no writers are working in today. And I believe it is absolutely a huge problem when you are not expressing the deeper theme of that genre.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I always ask my writing students, well, why does this book matter to you?
Yeah.
And they go off in tangents saying, well, the market really likes this. And I say, forget the market. Tell me why it matters to you. And you have said in your books that writers should write a story that's going to change them. Because if it changed them, it's going to change the world.
Exactly.
But I want to talk about the mixing of these genres because, I know in the publishing world, writers are playing with them. You have highly literary writers now writing thrillers. We have crime novelists writing romances. And so talk us about how somebody could do that. Give us an example of blending genres.
Sure. In the opening chapter of the book, I talk about 3 unwritten rules that determine the entire story business. And that is not just novels, that's film and television and video games. The first rule I talk about is that it is a genre business. All of these companies are in the business of buying and selling genres. And what are genres? Genres are simply plot types like action, love, detective, thriller, fantasy, and so on. And so you need to be writing the stories that the business, that is not only the publishers and the studios, but especially the readers want to buy. But then the rule number 2 is that to really be successful, you have to combine 2 to 4 genres in your story. And there's a really important reason behind that. Over the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a major increase in plot density in every medium. And here's the problem. What separates that top 1% of professional writers from everyone else is the ability to write complex plot.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there are more techniques that go into writing plot than all of the other major writing skills combined. And most writers simply don't know what those techniques. That's why they rely on these other books, because they're kind of a magic bullet.
Simply, yeah, they're
Just do this,
workbooks.
this, and this, and you've got it. Well, no, that's not the way it works with plot. It is very complex. And so the reason I say that, tell people you want to mix genres is because each genre is a plot system that's already been worked out for you, and the complexity is already embedded in the form. And it's been worked out over decades and sometimes centuries. And so that those plot beats are in the most dramatic order possible. Now, the reason that you want to mix genres is because as soon as you combine two genres, you get double, you add a third one in, you get triple the plot beats. This is the real secret to getting people into that competition of the top 1%.
That is great. I have to tell you that Mark Cecil, who is one of our hosts and a producer, and he just sold his novel to Knopf, he says, love John Truby and his work. And but he says, I still love 3-act structure. So Mark, keep listening, and hopefully you'll like it a little less. So I wonder if you can tell us a concrete example of something, a film or a book that has mixed two genres, and you think they did it great. And why do you think they did it so great?
Sure. Let me give you a few examples.
Okay.
One of the things I talk about in the book is that one of the ways you transcend the genre, which is the trick, that's rule number 3.
Right.
In order to be successful, you got to transcend the genre. Well, the way you do, there's a few ways to do that. One is that you execute the beats in a way that is different than they're normally done. And so, for example, in the myth story Avatar is primarily a myth story. However, it also combines with action and love. And James Cameron always uses these 3 genres. He's really good at them. He's really good at mixing them. And of course, he is the most popular filmmaker ever. Now, but the primary genre that he uses is myth. Now, Avatar is quite revolutionary in a certain way, in that it is the first film to bring back the female myth. Now, the female myth, I talk about this in the myth chapter. The female myth has been gone from Western culture for 3,000 years, and it is a huge loss. And just in the last 10 years, it has started to come back, and it's coming back hard and fast. And I believe it's going to be one of the major forms in the next few decades. It is huge. Now, you have to understand what that means. The male myth, which we've always thought of as myth, and Joseph Campbell's monomyth theory.
Right.
I think that's totally false. It is not the monomyth. It's not the story that is told by everywhere around the world. It is essentially the male warrior myth. And so, because that's all we've known for 3,000 years, we don't even know that the female myth story beats exist. Well, one of the things that Cameron does in doing a female myth is that it is an example of it is the talisman. The talisman is a major beat in myth. It's where early on in the story, the hero gets a physical object that has tremendous power and significance. And it helps to physically identify the true nature of that hero. Now, the normal type of talisman that you see in male warrior myths is something like the sword.
The sword, right. A weapon.
The sword and the stone. Well, in Avatar, because it's a female myth, it's the seed from the sacred tree. And so this is how one of the ways, and he does this throughout, that he flips the beat. Another example is one of the key distinctions between male myth and female myth. Male myth is based on the hunter. Female
Mhm.
myth is based on agriculture and the seasons and the
Right.
cycle. And so female myth, one of the key beats in female myth is rebirth. And so in Avatar, we have no less than 3 rebirths in that film alone. And so this is what it's part of knowing what are the beats in my form, but then how do I twist them and flip them in such a way that the reader, they get their beats, they get what they
Right.
want, but
Right.
they get it in a way they've never seen before, so they get to have their cake and eat it too.
Do you think that there is a difference between, stories that sell big and say, is there a separate category for Sundance stories, or do they still follow those beats?
Well, it depends on which particular genres they choose.
Right, that's right.
For example, I talk in the book about the detective story. Detective story has the most complex plot there is. And that is both a strength and a weakness. If you're good at that, then you get the power of a dynamite plot. But the
Right.
problem is you got to be able to write the most complex plot there is. Now, what happens is, and this goes back to the value and the importance of mixing genres. If you're working in a form like memoir, which is essentially a drama, and drama is not one of the genres in the book because it's much bigger. It is a story form, but it's much
Right.
bigger than a genre. There is no predetermined hero or opponent in drama.
Mhm.
Anyone can be the hero, anyone can be the opponent. Well, drama is notorious, as is memoir, for having very thin plot. And so it's a real struggle to get the kind of plot density that you need to get a story that's going to be popular. So what do? Well, one of the best techniques in writing memoir is to combine it with detective story. Detective story gives you the plot. Memoir does what memoir and drama does best. Drama has the most intense emotional punch of any story form that we have. And so this is something I talk about in the book when you're trying to transcend any of the genres. Use the plot beats of the genres to give you that fabulous plot, but then combine it with drama elements, which gives it a much stronger emotional and personal punch for the reader.
I want to, what was so fascinating to me in the book is that even in genres that I don't work in myself or read so much, there was always a nugget about how to live, which is, your subhead, how the world works. Like horror, to my surprise, horror you related with religion. But when I thought about it, I thought, oh my God, that's right, because horror is really about what we believe and what happens when our faith is subverted or taken away from us. And when you think about that, even the dumbest horror story, not to say horror stories are dumb, but I mean, some horror
Most
movies
of them are. Most of them are.
If you look deeper, when you start to not like the film or whatever, you realize it's because they gave up on that message.
Exactly.
They just gave up and they went into, I don't know if you saw the film Smile, the horror film Smile.
I have not seen that yet.
It starts out really great, just about a tormented, she's got a backstory, she's got a ghost psychologist who's dealing with patients who are just dying when they see somebody smile. And I mean, it's a great premise, but then it's sort of towards the last 3/4, they leave that premise and they just go to typical horror story stuff where it's, you're seeing people smiling and you're getting killed in more and more vicious ways. And it's interesting to see how, if they had, here's my question. So how does somebody writing in a genre, say horror, decide what other genre to mix it with? I mean, when I was looking at that, I thought, God, if they had put a love story in that might have been more interesting, because smiling, love stories, that. Is there any right way or wrong way to decide which genres go together?
Well, that's a great question. And there's 2 things involved in it. One is that it's probably ended up being a fairly boring horror story because they didn't transcend the form. And
Right, they did not.
Horror about the most important horror story and one of the most influential stories in history, which is Frankenstein.
Right,
where
right.
she gave us the manual for how to transcend the form, which and I talk about it as one of the great structure techniques of all time, which is over the course of the story, we flip the hero and the monster. In other words, at some point in the story, the monster becomes the hero.
Right.
And we see this technique in modern horror stories like Get Out and Shape of Water. And that's what kicks them to a much higher level. So it's not just a killing movie, a slasher movie. But so that's one of them. You got to transcend and you got to get into the deeper power of what that theme really gives you. And but the other thing has to do with mixing genres. First of all, there are some genres that naturally mix well together. For example, in the horror form, I talk about in the section on transcending horror, I talk about two major combinations with horror that kick it to a higher level. Horror plus myth, which is essentially the story of religion, and horror plus science fiction, which is what Frankenstein is.
That's right.
So these go together very well, and they also give you the advantage of making a story automatically more interesting, more distinct, and thematically more powerful. The other thing to keep in mind is that one of the techniques for writing a popular story is to mix genres that we don't normally see mixed.
Okay.
Because now there's a reason they're not normally mixed. It's because in certain ways they are opposite genres and they are telling exactly opposite thematic message and they have opposite plot beats. So they're really difficult to combine. But if you can figure out a way to do it, then you're doing something again that no one else is doing. You stand out from the crowd. Let me give you an example of that.
Great.
In the film Inception, we have a combination. Again, it's a mixed genre story. Almost everything we see now is a mixed genre story. It is a combination of heist and science fiction. And we've never seen that before. We've never seen heist plus science fiction. And this leads to the third key point in answering your question, which is when most writers try to mix genres, if they don't know what they're doing, they end up with story chaos. Why? Because each genre gives you a predetermined hero, opponent, desire line, and 15 to 20 plot beats. And so if you mix them and don't know how to do it, you end up with too many heroes, too many opponents, way too many plot beats, and sometimes contradictory themes. So here's the trick. You have to decide what is my primary genre.
Oh, okay.
And this will not only help you write the story, this helps you sell the story, because even though as writers we are writing mixed genre stories, publishers, Amazon, and so on, they want to know what is this genre. And so you say, oh, this is a thriller, when in fact, what it really is an action thriller. So here's to continue with this idea of the primary genre. Primary genre gives you your hero, your main opponent, your desire line, and the 15 to 20 plot beats that must be there. Then, when you're mixing in the other genres, you mix in the plot beats of those forms only where they work, only where they support
the main thing. Yeah. Okay. So it's still like your main genre is sort of like a tree, and the other mixing genres are like branches.
Yep.
That's really important. Okay, we've got an audience question. What makes a great premise and why? What makes it original?
Well, one of the biggest problems writers have right there. 99% of stories go wrong at the premise line.
Why?
It's because most writers, there's a number of reasons. But first of all, most writers come up with a premise that is a vague copy of a book or a movie that they saw 6 months ago.
Right.
And then they think, well, I'm going to make it different by combining it with this other movie that I saw. So it's this plus that, or this meets, the way it's used down is this meets that.
I know. I hate when they do that.
I hate it. It drives me out.
Yeah, it's crazy.
As though that is going to tell me anything about this particular story. But the point is, it's a copy. And as we were talking about it right at the very beginning, this is all about you being an individual. It's about you. They can only come to you for your story. And so if you're just doing what everybody else is doing, that's not going to cut it. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, and it's a huge mistake, is when you get an idea, you choose the wrong genre to express it.
Oh,
Because
talk more about that. That's
right,
interesting.
these genres are vehicles, they're plot vehicles to express the character's journey, the character change. And so if you choose the wrong, if you choose the wrong genre with the wrong plot beats, you're going to take that story in a radically different direction than if you chose a different genre. And where this really becomes tricky is in the genre families. In the book, I talk about each of these genres are distinct, but many of them are part of a family, which means they have certain similarities, they share certain techniques, and they have certain key differences. So what are some of the families? Well, speculative fiction is horror, fantasy, science fiction.
Right.
The myth form gives us myth, action, and Western. That is a grouping. But the most dangerous one, because the genres have so many similarities, is the crime family. Crime has crime, detective, thriller, and gangster. And so if you're doing something in the crime area that involves the crime, and you choose crime instead of detective, you've got radically different stories.
Right. That's
And
right.
so you may not be getting the most out of it. And this is why I say in The Anatomy of Story, my first book, that you want to take 2 weeks on that premise. You want to hammer that premise hard.
Right.
And you want to see that. And the first thing you want to do is, does this premise have a clear desire line for the hero? By that, I mean a specific goal that they're going to have in this story. And is there a clear main opponent? Because those two things will determine more of the success of that premise than anything else. They will also tell you, most likely, the best genre to use.
Can the opponent be something in the natural world, or must it be a person? Can the opponent be the person's self, or is that not a big enough story?
This is a common question that I get, and it's usually stated this way. My hero's main opponent is himself.
Okay.
Sounds very heavy, and there's a certain element of truth to it. But what they've just described is the weakness need. The weakness need is the part within the hero that's holding them back.
That's holding them back.
Holding them back so severely, it's ruining their life.
Right.
So you always need that external opponent, and it's best if it is a person. Now, yes, we can have man against nature, but those stories typically are very repetitive, and they typically do not rise to the level of great drama.
Okay.
Because you don't have the human opponent.
Right. You need that. Is there a difference between using these genre points in novels and in films?
There is a difference, but only in the sense that each medium handles the same genre in different ways based on how the structure and length of that medium. So, for example, film is basically 90 minutes to 2 hours. Unless you're James Cameron, you only get 2 hours in a film.
Okay.
So what you usually get there, especially if you're working within the American system, what you usually get is the single character, single hero with a very clear goal that they go after with great speed and intensity, and a fairly complicated plot, but only one that can hit the full 22 steps. And this is another place where 3-act structure gets it so wrong, which is it says, oh, you only need 2 to 3 plot beats. Well, besides the fact that plot beat is essentially the most vague term ever invented and tells me nothing about how to actually do that in a story.
Right.
What you really are talking about are reveals. And in a movie that is successful, a script that sells, it'll have anywhere from 7 to 10 reveals. And typically, for example, if you're doing a detective story, which has more plot, it'll even have more than that. Now, what does novel do? Novel expands because you have more space to work with.
Right. Right.
You got to have more plot, and you got to extend the plot over a much longer distance. And I liken it to a suspension bridge. The longer that suspension, the more difficult it is to support what you're laying on top of it. And so that's why you've got to have more plot for a novel. And typically, if I can put it in numbers, 3 to 4 times the plot that you get in film.
Okay.
And where does that happen? Primarily, it happens in the reveals. So, for example, when I was working on Anatomy of Story, I discovered that David Copperfield, one of the great coming of age stories, has 60 major reveals. And Dickens, of course, is great.
He's the best. Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. I love his plots.
He's the guy.
Yeah. He's a guy. We have another question this is actually from one of my UCLA students. What do you think about prologues? When and how to use them in a novel or in a film? I know in the literary landscape, prologue is kind of a dirty word because they feel like get right into the story first. Call it, if you're playing with time, call it chapter 1. This student wanted your take on it. So what do you think?
Sure. And yes, I think there is a lot of truth to avoiding prologue. However, what we have to do is we have to look at it structurally.
Right.
And what prologue usually is the ghost of the character.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay.
And so in most stories, you start right in. You are showing the weakness, need of the character. You're showing the problem that they're in, and they're already in that problem. But you refer back to the ghost, typically within the first third of the story,
right?
Typically through dialogue, through in a scene. And it's because you rarely need to actually show the ghost. And so unless you have a very strong reason why that ghost why you need to show the reader that ghost, you want to avoid it. And I would say this, it's like exposition. Writers always think they need more exposition than they need. The reader is very smart. They're going to pick up on that very quickly. Let me give you an example of how quickly you can get a ghost in.
Okay.
In American Beauty, the hero has got this. It's a voiceover. They're using a voiceover technique. And the hero he says, he basically tells you that he's a total loser, and his wife and daughter think he's a total loser.
Think so too.
And he's looking at his wife cutting roses, and he said, we used to be happy. Oh, no, she used to be happy. We used to be happy. Boom. That's your ghost.
You know it. That's right.
You know that there's problems in that marriage. We don't really know why. We're going to see why as the drama plays out. But it's going to be expressed much more powerfully in the present, in the conflict with that character, than anything we could do in terms of showing it, in the very first scene.
Right. There's a very famous Clint Eastwood movie where he's asked, God, why are you like this? What was your childhood like? And he says, short. You're smiling because you probably know it. He says short. And we never learn about it, which worked fine for the film because you didn't really need to. You don't imagine it. You don't need to.
You don't need it to. It's always about the present, and it's always about dealing with the weakness, the flaw in the character. That's much more important than the ghost. Right. Yes, the ghost is there because it sets up the flaw, but the flaw is the prime mover of the story. That's what the story is solving for.
Right. Okay, we have another question from Renee Norris. Can a prologue show the ghost of the antagonist rather than the protagonist? This is in a cold case detective novel.
Well, in a detective story, we almost always start with the opponent. And
really? Oh, okay.
And this is because we start with a murder.
Right, that's right.
And now, but here's the difference. We start with a murder, but we don't know who is committing it. right?
Right.
And
Right.
that is the main reason why the detective plot is the most complicated plot of all the genres, is because we're taking the main opponent, one of the two pillars of any story, and we're hiding it until the final scene. And so that creates massive problems of plot in terms of how do you do that. But it also gives you tremendous payoff. Now, what that means is, and I talk about this in the detective chapter, it means that the opening beats and the way that you as the writer deal with it is to start with the opponent. You want to put your mind in the opponent and put your mind in the opponent's plan, because that plan to not only commit the murder, but hide the murder, and hide the murder is the trick, that plan determines the whole book. You've got to get that right, and you've got to get the overall complexity of that plan. It's got to be an ingenious plan, so ingenious that it has the opportunity, it almost fools the smartest person in the story, which is the detective.
That's great. That's great. Okay, we have another question. Let me find, this is from Mark again. What are some reliable techniques you could offer to generate maximum emotion in your audience reader through your story structure?
Well, that's a fairly big question. We could talk about that for quite a while. It really starts off at the beginning of the story, and this is something I always tell writers, that they've heard that 90% of stories fail in the middle pages, and that's
Right.
true, they do, but that is not the source of the failure. The source of the failure is in the opening. It's in those
Oh,
first few pages, almost always. If you have problems with your story, go to the setup. It's not set up properly, and you will find most of the problems that are unraveling in the middle pages. And this is one of those things, which is emotional payoff for the reader comes first from identifying with the character up front, emotionally identifying with the character. And
right.
that's why those opening, it's one of the reasons why those opening two major structure steps are so important, because not only do they set up the entire story, they set up the emotional connection between reader and hero. And what are those two steps? Of course, they're, first of all, weakness, need, and second of all, desire. If you set up, I always tell writers, because they're always told, well, got to catch the reader in the first 5 to 10 pages, which is true. But of course, the people giving that wisdom never tell you how.
Right, that's right.
It's just one of these wise sayings that you hear. And of course, they never give you any specifics. But the way you do it is, and this includes emotional identification for the reader, is in the first few pages, you've got to suggest a ghost, establish problem, weakness, need, and desire of that character. If you do that, now desire is one thing that might be extended a little bit, because especially in novel, we spend more time establishing weakness, need at the beginning. Right. But basically, those are the things, if you can establish those fairly early, you have the reader. And then everything else is going to play out that. Now, the reason it's such a complicated question is that's what plot is about. We think of plot as those events on the surface that, that are playing out the battle between hero and the opponent, and they are. But what they're really about is they are giving us the steps for the character and thematic development of the story. But those are under the surface. That's why I call that line, that the surface line of the story is the desire line. The subterranean line, where all the real work is happening and all the emotional work is happening, has to do with weakness, need, moral argument, and the final self-revelation.
There are some films and books where the character does not have self-revelation at all. I'm thinking of, it was also a great movie, Leaving Las Vegas, where Nicolas Cage is presumably the hero. And he starts out wanting to kill himself by drinking because he killed his wife and child in an auto accident. He never wavers from that. At the end of the movie, he does what he set out to do. But there's a secondary character, the prostitute he hires to help him, who falls in love with him, who has all the moral issues. I'm wondering, like, what you think about a story like that, where the main character doesn't change, but somebody else does.
Well, there are a number of famous and great stories where that occurs.
Oh, really?
Chekhov is the king of no self-revelation.
Oh, okay.
But here's the distinction. He's doing that on purpose.
On purpose.
Because
right.
that's the theme. That's the larger theme.
That's right.
These people are incapable of change.
That's right.
I'm not going to have a self-revelation for them. It's also one of the key beats in a Black comedy. Black comedy purposely prevents the hero from having a self-revelation because that makes the point to the audience even stronger. Because it's so clear to the audience that he should have had a self-revelation. The fact that he doesn't just proves that these people are hopeless.
Okay.
So the trick is, do it. If you're going to do it on purpose. Do it on purpose. Do it for a reason, because otherwise, what the reader is signing on for, among other things, is to get some growth in this person they're investing in. So you got to have a very good reason not to do that. It's the same reason you got to have a very good reason in a love story that the two people don't end up together. Because I don't want to invest in the love of these two people if you're just going to have it break up at the end. Why did I do this at all? But and the other thing is to keep in mind, if this is important to you, that lack of self-revelation is one of the things that will decrease the popularity of the story.
Okay. Yeah, people want to see other people realize their mistakes in a way. Yeah. They want to identify. I want to show this gorgeous book again. Whoops, I can never get it right in the camera. The Anatomy of Genres. Pick it up at your local indie bookstore, bookshop.org. I'm telling you, it's like this book and John's other book are always on my desk. I mean, it's invaluable. Oh, which brings me to another question before I sign off, which is, so what advice could you give beginning writers? First, have a great premise. Make sure you have all the points. Make sure your first pages are a proper setup. Then do you tell them to just write and then go back and make sure you have all the points and the reveals? Or does that all happen before you sit down and write?
I never suggest that a writer will. This is one of the great lures. And, people give various justifications for it. Oh, I have such a critical voice that I've got to just get it on paper. Or they say, I'm a pantser, so I can't do this. You just made probably the biggest mistake you could make as a writer. Because again, I go back to this. We're trying to get to the top 1%.
Right.
And that means mastery of plot. And that means plot is something you have to plan out very carefully from the very beginning. And you do it by starting with the opponent's plan. That is the key to plot. And so what I would say to beginner writers, obviously there's a lot you're going to have to learn. So the first thing you got to learn is the 7 steps, 7 major structure steps. But when you're getting into these upper levels of storytelling, it's all about mastery of plot. And then once you've mastered the plot of that genre, and that includes specializing in only 2 or 3 genres because these are complex. So once you've mastered the main genre, then it's how do I transcend the form? So I'm not doing the generic genre story that everyone else is writing, because that will not get me into the top 1%.
Right. What do you say to writers who say, well, and I mean, I think they're wrong because I've experienced it myself, but writers who say, if I plan everything out beforehand, where's the surprises for me? Where's the creativity? I happen to think there's tons more creativity that way by planning everything out and knowing your plot and knowing your structure. It's like having a skeleton. Yeah. So what would you say to people like that who say, well, where's the creativity?
It's an interesting question. And I've, of course, heard that many times.
I'm sure you have.
And the first thing I would say is, what do you think is more important, that you get surprises or that your reader gets surprised?
That's smart.
because again, what plot comes from surprise. Plot
Right.
comes from reveals. You
Right.
got to plan those because not only are they very difficult to set up, but in order to have a great plot, those surprises, those reveals have to build. You can only do that by looking at the big picture
The big
of
picture.
plot
That's
to
right.
see how everything connects together. But the other thing I would say is exactly what you just said, which is I guarantee you, if you just get this good, strong, basic prep framework, the surprises that you're going to have are going to be immense
Yep,
as
that's
you
right.
go through the path. And that part of that is you don't have to stay locked to that framework that you start with. If you're not making changes along the path of writing the story, you're doing it wrong. Because
Right.
this is, I always say that this structure is the scaffolding that will
Right.
allow you to understand what creative leaps I can make that will work and what creative leaps I make that will not work.
We have one more question from Robbie Robinson. Hi, Robbie. Should significant plot beats align with certain pages, like 10% of the
No.
novel, 1/3? Good. I'm glad you said that.
God, no. God, no. I
Okay.
absolutely despise that. This idea in the last 20 years that has come out about midpoint is complete nonsense. The idea that you want to have this plot beat happens at this page is the worst kind of mechanical writing you can do. And by the way, if you're writing scripts and you do that, they spot them a mile away.
Really? That's so
Readers.
interesting.
Oh yeah, no, and that's another thing about 3-act structure. Nobody is using it. Nobody who's any good is using it. Partly because the readers know what you're doing. They've read all these books too, and so it means you're doing what everyone else is doing. Your point is to do what no one else is doing. So yeah, totally stay away from that. Now, underneath that is a true need, which is pacing. Yes, you have to have good pacing in the story. But I find that if you hit your structure steps, the major structure steps, either the 7 or the 22, and that includes then in genre the major plot beats of that form, the pacing will work automatically.
Okay.
Because that's why those plot beats are in there in that order.
Okay. This is great. This is great. I want to thank everybody for coming. We've already gone over a time. I could have talked like another hour and a half with you, John. I want to encourage everybody. You want to buy this book. You really, really want to buy this book, and you want to buy The Anatomy of Story. It's for any writer, anybody who wants to think more deeply about their life. Bookshop.org, any independent bookstore. John, I want to ask you, do you want to promote the consulting you do or your studio?
Well, I would say
there
that anybody who is interested in my courses or in my story software to just go to truby.com.
Okay, I'm putting it up right now, truby.com for courses and software. And I am telling everybody that I've gone to the course and I have been in the course, and it's just tremendous, just absolutely tremendous. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, John. John, you don't go away. Everybody else go away. I'll see you guys all next week.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you all for being here.